Welcome back, everyone, and thanks for coming back to hear more this week. I hope you've had a great week, and as always, I pray that once again you'll take away something edifying today. Now, last week was quite a long session, and I think I can promise that it's going to be no worse and maybe a little bit easier tonight. Tonight's lesson is part 2 of what we began last week on the topic of the abomination of desolation. Let me just get my thing working here. Here we go. So session 10, the desecrators of the temple, part 2. In that image, by the way, that we just showed you, just go back for a moment, you'll see a huge statue of Zeus sitting in a temple, and this is probably slightly bigger, but on the same sort of idea as what happened to the Jewish temple in the past when Antiochus IV erected a huge statue of Zeus in the temple area. And perhaps something similar will happen in the future. Okay, last week we looked at the fact that a time is coming up soon in which the temple of God in Jerusalem, which is yet to be rebuilt in fact, will at least be partially rebuilt, and there will be a dedicated altar, and probably also a sanctified holy place in the temple. And the man of sin will come along, who is an invader of Israel, and he'll sit in the holy place, in that dedicated holy place, and proclaim himself to be God. His act of sacrilege will be more than an act of offence. It's also a very important marker in time in the prophetic timeline of the Bible, and it's linked to a variety of prophecies in Daniel and elsewhere. And it indicates that humanity is moving into the very last throes of its history. Links to this event include the dragon being cast from heaven in Revelation 12, and empowering the global beast, the last of the Antichrists, in Revelation 13. It's also the completion of the 70th great week of Daniel's prophecy in Daniel 9. We know that the last half of the last week was waiting to be completed, and this marks the point at which that completion begins. Joel also spoke of a time of latter rain empowering for the church, and it's the time of the latter rain. And Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2 speaks of a campaign of lying wonders that's going to sort of come to the world in the last days, forcing people into a choice between Christ and Antichrist, humanism and God-centered religion. And this starts at this time too, because at this time there is an unleashing of supernatural power. The restraints against powers of deception are taken away as well. And in Revelation 10 we find that there's a renewed great gospel commission. The angel says to John, who stands for the church, go one more time into all the world and preach the gospel. So there is one final push for the gospel commission, and it's a global push. And if we're going to take it even further, Jesus spoke of this time being marked by the powers of heaven being moved, and there's going to be some kind of, let's say, dramatic departure of a planet from its orbit at the same time as the temple of Jerusalem is desecrated. Now, in ancient Egypt, it was quite common for a conquering pharaoh to have a pillar, a pillar carved to commemorate a successful military campaign, or maybe a monument built as his legacy after death. Such pillars and monuments, self-aggrandizement aside, later became some of the best accounts of the history of the period for later scholars. But in the case of some overthrows which were driven by hatred, especially if it was a civil war, the records of previous administrations could be defaced or even destroyed, deliberately obliterating and hiding their histories from later researchers. The malice of the conqueror was vented by removing or defacing the physical record of the previous pharaoh or his dynasty, and sometimes the name of a predecessor was even chiseled out of the victory stele by his perhaps less successful successor, who was now making the predecessor's great conquests those of his own. as he subsumed the earlier history into his own history. So such falsifications were not limited to Egypt. The Sumerians and Babylonians were also known to do such things, and they also wrote glorified accounts about themselves and about their ancestry and victories. And to some degree, even the wise Greeks, who were probably the ancient world's best historians, were not beyond editing history to explain their own grandiose ideas about themselves. Even the Church Fathers, who we have to say were mostly from Greek colonies, made some early attempts to edit the biblical chronology. They tried to make it come into better agreement with events as they stood in the Greek version of history. Excuse me. The great pride of the Greeks was part of the Alexandrian ideal that the world should be conquered and bettered by the glories of the classical Greek culture and its religions. And the image in the background here is an image of Alexander the Great. At one level, Alexander the Great's campaigns arose from a benevolent desire to spread the glories of Greece across the world. And it's probably true that similar motives drove many empire builders, not least in modern times the Catholic Church and the modern New World Order, who all in their funny way think they're going to better the world by what they're trying to put in place. History gives us at least 13 cities of Alexandria, of course named after Alexander, founded during the lifetime of Alexander the Great himself, and spread across the ancient Near Eastern world, each designed to be a local centre from which to disseminate the culture of Greece to the world. Now, only 2 of these cities are still called Alexandria today, but the list originally included Alexandria of Egypt, Iskandaria of Iraq, Alexandria Asiana of Iran, Alexandria of Ariana, Afghanistan. Ariana's been in Afghanistan, sorry. Alexandria of the Caucasus, Afghanistan. Alexandria on the Oxus, Afghanistan. Alexandria of the Aracosians, Afghanistan. And Alexandria Bucephalus of Pakistan. Then there was Alexandria on the Indus in Pakistan. Alexandria Eskhate of Tajikistan, Alexandria by the Latmos, now called Alinda, of Turkey, Alexandria Sebrine of Turkey, and Alexandria Troas of Turkey. In each new centre, the Greek language and gods were to stand at least alongside the local language and gods. In the more resistant cases, the local gods and language were to be thrown out altogether. And so we come to Antiochus IV Epiphanes with his attempts in the 2nd century BC to bring the Jews the Greek culture and wisdom. While Jewish history paints him as a kind of epitome of evil, his actions were not entirely out of character with the broader Greek agenda of Hellenizing the world. However, he was certainly a little less patient than some Greek conquerors, and his disgust for the exclusivism of the Jewish religion and his lack of patience with Jewish stubbornness was a little more obvious than that of others who also conquered the Holy Land. We study his actions now as part of this series of end-time events, as we are given to understand from Daniel, Jesus, and Paul that the persecution and oppression of both Israel and the Church in the last days will share many of the characteristics of the persecution initiated against Israel under Antiochus IV in 167 BC. Today, as then, the persecution will reflect a broader Greek, and for Greek today we could read perhaps humanist New World Order, agenda. Sorry. To bring the world away from its, well, today as then, the persecution will reflect a broader Greek agenda. And this will bring the world away from its village gods, so to speak, and over to a global religion and culture that operates from higher globalist motives. And when I say village gods, I'm sort of referring to the denominations of Christianity, various groups of religions and worship of various gods within Hinduism, even Islam could be considered almost a village god, the worship of Allah. And there is an idea today to go to a sort of one universal God, which is sort of really the common God that all people would like to think they're worshipping. Whereas that's a debate for another time, but this is kind of the notion that the Catholic Church is pushing ahead at the moment as it tries to bring in all other religions into a grand union with the religion of Christianity, with the Catholic Church as its head. This push toward a global religion is not going to be at first a campaign of overthrow, but it's going to be an attempt rather to soothe and to assimilate. Such moves at assimilation are already going on and have been actually for over 35 or 40 years, since the World Council of Churches began to bring together the non-Catholic churches. More recently, in the last decade or so, the World Council of Churches has then began to align itself with the Catholic Church, and in that same time, the Catholic Church has begun talking of building shrines that will be places where people of all religions can meet with the Catholics, and centering that worship in the first place around Mary. Now, if that voluntary assimilation fails, the pressure will have to ramp up in a campaign of public limitation. And when this campaign of limitation should fail, the only next step really is degeneration into a campaign of eradication. And this we've already seen in several regimes in the last century, probably most notably in that of Adolf Hitler. So let's watch a video now that links the Vatican to the Antichrist.
Erev Tov Charim, I'm Stephen Ben-Nun. You're watching Israeli News Live. Very interesting broadcast this evening, and let me just take you real quick just to kind of show you the headline that we are looking at this evening. It's rtnews.com there. Turkey supports ISIS, wants to revive Ottoman Empire, Syrians UN envoy. What you're looking at here on the screen and behind you here is this is President Erdogan in the picture there, and he is seen amongst all of the different warriors that were used in their different armaments and stuff back during the time of the Ottoman Empire's reign for, oh gosh, I guess about a 500-year period. In fact, it was the Ottoman Empire that built the current old city walls around Jerusalem that was done years ago. And very, very interesting to say the least here. But as soon as I saw this, the first thing that comes to my mind is that, well, it's not going to be long before the Christian community is going to say, this is your Antichrist. Let me tell you real quick, he's not the Antichrist. But I will say this, the Vatican has been grooming him just for that purpose. And everything that has been happening, that's been going on in the Middle East has been to push this man to a position to make him look like that, yes, he is the Antichrist that's to come. In fact, Wally Shubat wasted no time at all on jumping on this. When I looked up Erdogan Antichrist, practically every article he's got is the one that is saying this may very well be the Antichrist. But you have to look at what the Scripture says about the Antichrist. In fact, the only place we see the word Antichrist is in the book of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, but it's only in the 1st and 2nd parts. There's one thing I wanted to read to you, though, from that particular book there that might give you a little insight about who the Antichrist really is. And that's 1 John 2:18. He says, little children, it is the last time, and as you have heard that Antichrist shall come. All right, now that's a singular Antichrist. All right, even now are there many Antichrists, plural, whereby we know that it is the last time. Notice what he says next. Verse 19, 1 John chapter 2, verses 18 and 19. They went out from us, but they were not of us. For had they been of us, they would no doubt have continued with us. You see, this is one of the main things that you can see who the Antichrist really is by that statement in itself. The Antichrist was actually among the believers of Jesus in his day, but they went out from them. Go back and look at historically and see which ones were the ones that were going out from the true believers. Look at the ones that didn't stay with James. Look at the ones that did not believe Peter's teachings. This is where you end up with the early church fathers. There's actually a division in the early church fathers. If you go back and read the historical documentation, the early church fathers, there's two different branches of early church fathers. One of those branches actually put together with Constantine the Roman Catholic Church. They went out from us because they were not of us. And what did the early Catholic Church do? They burnt all the ancient documents that they could find, all the writings that were written about Jesus. They burnt as many of them as they possibly could. They didn't want any other doctrine except their own out there. And then they went on a crusade to murder all the early Christians that believed anything contrary to what they taught. This is what the Antichrist spirit was doing then. And as John said, there were many of them already. And they had went out from us because they were not of us, or they would have continued with us. But nonetheless, it's been a long crusade for the Vatican to come up with a good man that they could make their Antichrist or a caliphate among the Arabic people, or the Mahdi, that he is called in the Quran, which is nothing but a Vatican written book to begin with. And so I say this also for the Arabic people that may listen to the broadcast. In fact, yesterday we had a lot of Arabic people and also those that were anti-Semites that listened to the broadcast. If you're wondering why we had so many down comments on there, we would have loved to have actually put the comments up for you, but the vulgarity of the language of all the anti-Semitic people that were against Israel that came on as a result of the video that we did about the Palestinians calling for more blood to water the ground of Israel with more blood, this is what caused all the downing of the video there. It is amazing to say the least, but the F word was used so freely and every other type of nasty word that you could possibly think of. Had they just disagreed without all the vulgarity, I would have gladly posted their comments so you could see. But these were people that hated the state of Israel. They were calling us nothing but a Zionist propaganda news network. Well, you have to remember, we weren't the ones that published. It was the Fatah, one of their own members on their Facebook page. They're the ones that published this, not us. We were only quoting what Israel National News had put out there. And do understand, I'm not against the Palestinian people either. I do realize, and I have stated before, that Israel should treat them as a brother, especially if they want to live in peace. But if they don't want to live in peace, then what can you expect? Especially in the situation that we have now. Nothing but chaos in the area there. Now, back here to Erdogan. Let me share with you a little bit about what's written in the article here. It says, Syria's envoy to the UN has accused Turkey of supporting terrorist groups and covering for their invasion into Syria, urging the UN to end Ankara's violations and crimes. Bashar al-Ja'afari also warned that Erdogan's goal is to revive the Ottoman Empire. Well, you know, it's interesting to say the least. I would say there's a lot of truth to it just by the mere staged photo that Erdogan is being a part of. Some people are saying that he's claiming to be God now. Again, you have to understand, this is what the Vatican has been trying to do. They have been grooming a man to make him look like the Mahdi, and they have intentionally looked for someone that could fit the bill so it would take all the heat off of them in the first place. We're going to be going into a lot more of this. I've been doing some deep research on the Antichrist because of things that I've stumbled on with this article here to prove to you even more so who that Antichrist really will be. And I know a lot of people, we've said, and we do know this because you have to remember John said there were many Antichrists. Every Pope of Rome has been an Antichrist. Antichristo, the original word that this comes from, which means instead of Christ. He is a substitute. He is one that is like Christ. That's why it says that they were, John says they went out from us because they were not of us. So the Antichrist actually has to be a person that professes Christianity. It cannot be someone that is a Muslim. He doesn't profess Christianity. It has to be someone that is a professor of Christianity, professing that Christianity is true, but yet in a perverted sense of it. Anyway, Syria's permanent representative to the UN wrote in his letter to the World Body Task reported those groups are being provided with funding, weapons, material, logistic support by states and regimes from the region and beyond. In other words, the United States as well. While mentioning other players allegedly involved in the spread of the Islamic terrorism, Jaf Afari accused Turkey and President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of playing the most active role. During the crisis, Turkish interference in Syria's internal affairs took many forms, including direct involvement of the regime of Erdogan. The Turkish armed forces, an offensive military operation in support of terrorists, Ja'afari wrote to the UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon and the UN Secretary Council as cited by RIA Novosti. All right, now, it goes on to say, those, speaking of the Turkish forces, have also provided covering fire for the terrorists moving inside Syria territory or along the Syrian-Turkish border in order to facilitate the infiltration of terrorist mercenaries from Turkish territory into Syrian territory. The letter said in his letter to the UN, Ja'afari cited the downing of the Russian Su-24 jet as another example of Erdogan's attempts to up his regime involvement in the smuggling of stolen Syrian oil by ISIS into Turkey and the smuggling of weapons and material by Turkey to the terrorists in Syria. Yeah. Let me give you this last little section right here. Appealing to the UN, the Syrian envoy also said it was Erdogan's intention to revive the Ottoman colonial legacy. Ja'afari pointed to the Turkish leader's statements on protecting the people of Turkish descent a few years ago, ignoring the fact that they might be citizens of other countries. Syria has also called on the UN to take a firm stand to put an end to these violations and crimes committed by Ankara. Ja'afari's letter was only the latest attempt to draw attention of the international community to Turkey's alleged support of Islamic militants, including the Islamic State, ISIS, formerly ISIS-ISIL. Now, let me just share with you some interesting insight on this. We have watched with all the things ever since the downing of the Russian bomber, the Su-24, the United States, with no issues, no backpedaling or nothing, has stood behind Turkey 100%. They are willing, in fact, to go to war with Russia over the downing of this Russian bomber, if that's what it meant. It is obvious that Rome is causing the United States to keep Turkey up there as if they're a great nation there and to back them to help make this alliance that is going on. Now, you have to also remember, Turkey and Saudi Arabia also are very close allies and partners, and they're there trying to topple Bashar al-Assad. And now we see that Turkey has invaded a little while back into Iraq. They're trying to push Russia into a war, and we see too that according to the biblical prophecy that Nineveh would be totally obliterated. They would be without inhabitant. And by the way, Nineveh, that is speaking of in the scripture there, is actually Mosul. Mosul and Nineveh, they cross the river from one another. And this is where Turkey has gone in there, and they have been doing what? They have been doing a genocide campaign against the Kurdish people in that region there. And now Russia is being put into a position, not only is he going to have to protect Bashar al-Assad from Turkey and the United States coming against him, and you can't say the United States is not coming against Bashar al-Assad. It is the rebel forces that the U.S. is backing. U.S. has backed ISIS forces as well. So has Turkey. And what are they trying to do? Topple Bashar al-Assad. The U.S. Obama administration is still saying that Bashar al-Assad must go. Even John Kerry spoke about Russia and Iran's leaders as problem children if they don't agree that Bashar al-Assad must go. So you can't help but wonder. I mean, it's very strange the way things are going on in the Middle East there. And I've been looking very seriously too, as far as that King of the South in Daniel 11, could that be Saudi Arabia and the alliance that he is putting forth? I thought about recently when I saw the mention of Saudi Arabia sending in 100,000 troops there to fight against Syria. And out of that coalition of troops there, or as they say, ISIS, but they're really, the goal is to top Bashar al-Assad. And one of the main things that Saudi Arabia is doing, those fighters include 90,000 from the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the different regions down there. Kuwait would bring together that, and 10,000 troops from the United States. Well, if you look in Daniel 11, there is mention of 10,000 times thousands there that would actually be destroyed. Now, I'm not saying it is as of yet, because I'm really studying and prayerfully looking at this. Could that be the force that is being spoken about that they're putting together with the United States in Saudi Arabia? And is Saudi Arabia that King of the South? There again, it's a conjecture at this point here. I don't say that it's so. I'm prayerfully looking more into this. Let me share with you some more things, though, that's going on. And this is something that the Vatican did that was reported on Haaretz.com, is reported on many different media outlets, but I'll just share this with you as well. This happened a little while back. It's been, a few months ago. Turkey summons Vatican's envoy after Pope describes the Armenian genocide. Pope defends his pronouncement by saying it is his duty to honor the memory of the innocent men and women, children, priests, and bishops who were senselessly murdered. That was in the beginning of the 20th century, back in 1915, when the Ottoman Empire, before its collapse there, had murdered, some estimates by scholars, 1.5 million Armenians that were murdered there. And many of the, you have to remember, many of the Armenians are Christians even to this day. We have the Armenian quarter in Jerusalem there that makes up the first quarter on the right-hand side when you come into Jaffa Gate. That is the Armenian quarter. Wonderful people. Have many Armenian friends there. And but anyway, Pope Francis in Aram says here, during an American Rite Mass marking 100 years since the mass killing of the Armenians on April 12th of 2015, says that the Armenian slaughter, Pope remembers first genocide of the 20th century. In Turkey, even a respected filmmaker can't discuss Armenian genocide. David and Goliath in the Caucasus. The Pope Kim Kardashian escaped Nazis, the PR and politics of genocide recognition. Reuters noted, Turkey told the Vatican's ambassador on Sunday it was deeply sorry and disappointed that Pope Francis had called the 1915 mass killings in Armenia a genocide. An official said, adding the Pope's comments had caused a problem of trust. Turkey also called its ambassador to the Vatican back to Ankara for consultation, the foreign ministry said on Sunday. Now, again, we have to remember, Turkey is backing ISIS. The United States helped fund it. Even, the funny thing is, even the Mossad, Israeli Mossad, has also been involved with this organization of ISIS. There's been proof. They had one of their own top ranking officers that was leading ISIS in the field captured by the Kurds. So this is another reason why you see the United States backing and turning the other cheek, so to speak, while Turkey went into Iraq and attacked the different Kurdish villages there and killing the Kurds there. As we saw in RT's footage, we even see Navy SEALs working with the Turkish military on this. So you can't say that they're not involved. They are involved. And why is all this happening to begin with? It seems to me that the Vatican, along with the United States, NATO, and their allies, they're trying to rile up the Muslim world because they need an Arabic Antichrist. And the sad thing is Erdogan, he's gullible enough to fall for all this. They have put him into power, they have placed him where they want him, and they're raising him up to be that Mahdi, so that the Vatican can look like the Savior. You see, this is why we see even in Daniel 11 verse 14, the lawless of thy people, Daniel's people, the lawless of thy people will try to marry the vision. And this is what's happening here. They're trying to bring to pass Isaiah's prophecy of chapter 2. This is exactly what we see going on in the Middle East there. And Israel, he has his own lawless ones. They're not even the Orthodox community. I'm not talking about the Orthodox community that just signed the agreement stating that the Vatican is their friends and that they should work together and basically just opened up and married them. You know, if you guys never read the book of Malachi, let me just share one thing. I will share one thing with you in the book of Malachi, because I'm going to tell you something, guys. You need to know this. In Malachi chapter 2, let me just, I think this is really important that I take you to this here. In Malachi chapter 2, Malachi says a very astonishing prophecy here that many people completely overlook. And I am amazed that so many people don't even see this part here. And it speaks about Judah here. Let me just find this real quickly for you. I think this is it right here. And verse 11, and Judah hath dealt treacherously, and an abomination is committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. For Judah hath profaned the holiness of the Lord, which he loveth, and hath married the daughter of a strange god. Do you not know what they're doing when they say they married the daughter of a strange god? This is when Judah, and remember, it's Judah is who's at home right now. The house of Judah is the ones that are in Israel. The whole creation of the state of Israel was so that it could fulfill the prophecy of Zechariah, where God said that the house of Judah would return home first. This is where God would take the time where he would reveal himself to the house of Judah. But while they're back, this is what God says. Judah hath dealt treacherously, and an abomination is committed in Israel and in Jerusalem. Why? It's a covenant for the land. For Judah hath profaned the holiness of the Lord, which he loveth, and hath married the daughter of a strange god. The strange god is the Pope of Rome. The daughter. Bringing them in together. Now notice what it says in verse 12. May the Lord cut off to the man that doeth this, him that calleth, and him that answereth out of the tents of Jacob, and him that offer an offering unto the Lord of hosts. The man that married in Rome into Israel may be cut off. Is it going to be held to the charge of Shimon Peres? I don't know. Is it going to be held to all these rabbis that have just signed this document, marrying in to the great whore of Rome? I don't know. That's up to God to decide. But what I'm trying to show you is that prophecies, friends, prophecy is being fulfilled on a regular basis. The Vatican is only setting up the stage. What do you think? Let me show you something here. Germans torch 222 Muslim refugee homes. See, that's another thing. The whole crisis, the refugee crisis, was created by the Arabic people to begin with. Of course, supported by the United States, their ISIS movement. But the ISIS are the people that created the refugee crisis, as we have seen in Micah chapter 7, I shared with you before. Micah chapter 7, let me just read it to you. So we don't have to go back and forth. I want you to see these things. All right? And Micah clearly prophesied what would happen there. And I will come back by God's grace very soon. I want to share with you guys what the Lord has been revealing to me that is going on in Daniel 11. I have sincerely been praying before the Lord about Daniel 11. And the tough thing is God said it wouldn't be revealed until the end time. So, I don't know if he'll reveal it, because of these things. I have no idea. Anyway, verse 13, notwithstanding, the land shall be desolate because of them that dwell therein, for the fruit of their doings. That's what, this is speaking about Syria. Actually, it's Assyria, which is not just Syria. It includes parts of Iraq, Syria, all the different regions there that are war-torn over there. They do it of their own doings. And now we see what's going on. Just like the sister from Norway. When I got the little thing that friends shared with me on Facebook not long ago, the prophecy of the 90-year-old woman in 1968 that talked about that in the latter days, when the coming of the Christ would be near, that there would be a huge refugee crisis that would come up out of the Middle East, up into Europe, up into Scandinavia. And that these people would end up being treated just like the Jews were before the Second World War. And the sister said God would have enough. The iniquity would be filled. And that's the iniquity of the Amorites. It would be fulfilled at that point there. And then God would bring judgment. Now I realize many of these people that come up in here are nothing but a bunch of warriors to begin with. Young men ready to fight, ready to cause trouble. But there's many of these refugees that are displaced. Arabic people that missionaries have longed their entire life to be able to witness to. And now they come into your own country where they're no longer under Sharia law and the opportunity to witness to them is there. And instead, what happens? Torch 222 Muslim refugee homes. That's the way we receive them. I realize that there is an epidemic also in Europe. I realize that. I know that they're being killed by the thousands as far as the European citizens that are being murdered here that's not being reported by the news. Women that are being raped by these gangs. But this stuff is being incited, and the neo-Nazis that are raising up here in Germany that are doing this like they did to the Jews is being done intentionally to cause unrest, to cause the Muslim world to go nuts after seeing all their people murdered and stuff. So that why? So that they can say that there is a Muslim Mahdi. So Wally Shubat can become the famous guy who's nothing but a Vatican puppet. And I'm going to tell you something. Me and Wally were going to be on an interview together once before. But the sister that was having us on her program together, we were coming on, they called me up and they told me, whatever you do when you're on the interview with Wally Shubat, you do not speak anything against what he has to say when it comes to the Antichrist. You do not speak your own opinion. This is the honest to God's truth. I was told not to speak my own opinion. And I'm like, what is it? I didn't even know. I've heard of Wally Shubat, but I didn't know anything about the brother. And I'm like, you got to be kidding me. You expect me just to keep my mouth shut and say nothing? And the sister tells me, she says, Wally doesn't look at the Catholic Church as being the Antichrist, and he knows it's the Muslims. And so therefore, and the sister tells me, Steve, I believe that you're right, but when he's on this interview, you're to keep your mouth shut and do not go against him one single bit. Let him say what he wants. Now, they had already asked me to tell all the people that listened to our channel about the interview, in which we did. Back then, we weren't that big at the time. We had maybe 20,000 subscribers. But because of that, I went and researched who the man really was. And when I saw who he really was, I went back to the sister. I said, I need Wally to call me. I need to speak to him personally. He never would. I said, because I cannot do an interview with this man and then hold my tongue and say nothing. I said, I at least need to, I would like to speak to the brother, as brother to brother, about my differences with him before we go on a program. At least to express my own opinion with him. And of course, I was told that it would be done. He never called me. And when the time came for the interview, They wanted me to do it anyway. I backed out. I said, no. I said, now you've already got all the people that follow our ministry going to go listen to this and believe a lie? I was forced to have to go tell our own people that followed the teachings that we were doing at the time. I was forced to have to go tell them the truth of what I believe and what Wally would actually be saying in this particular meeting, and I backed out of the interview completely myself. I spoke about it. I showed how he was not a terrorist turned Christian from the Palestinians, how CNN had exposed him, etc. All kinds of things that I had discovered. And the thing was, you talking about bringing out the worst in Wally Schubot, when I did that, that really got him riled up, but he should have come to me. I tried to get him to come to me so we could speak about it, but there was no way I would allow the people to believe a lie. Especially when they threw me out there for the wolves, just to be thrown out there to be attacked and be told that everything I believe is a lie and I'm supposed to keep my mouth shut? That's nonsense. If you have a different opinion, it's okay, but we should at least be able to speak about it as brothers in peace and in love. Instead, I got the worst email you could have ever imagined. I've never got an email with more curse words in it than from any other person. Not even the people that were putting the nasty comments on the channel about the Palestinian video we did news yesterday. Not even all these people that did all the thumbs down with all their nasty words couldn't even compare to the nasty things that this man wrote me. So, my point is, and I know Wally, he married a Catholic girl. He has written a book, and I forget the title of it, but it's dealing with the Catholicism. He's very supportive of the Catholic Church. So he is a main man to help promote a Muslim Mahdi for Rome. He has been taken in by all the big-time ministers, Chuck Missler, and Chuck's a friend of mine. Chuck supports what Wally does and is big for the Muslim Antichrist. In fact, for a while there, Chuck was actually backstepping a little bit. I spoke with Chuck on this extensively. I told Chuck at one time, Chuck, you never taught like this. And when I sent Chuck some serious things about what the Vatican was doing, Chuck had an emergency meeting, and Chuck put out there as well to his own people. He said, we may have underestimated the Catholic Church. And then, of course, Chuck went back the other way again. But friends, let me tell you something. This is going to be the man, I believe. Now, I can't say for sure, but I believe this is who they're going to use as their Muslim Antichrist. They have to make the Pope of Rome look like a savior. And I don't say that Pope Francis is the last pope. There still may be another pope come in. But they're all the Antichrist because that's what John says. He speaks about the one Antichrist that will come, and then he says there's many Antichrists already. And they went out from us because they were not of us. So this is what we see. And what's happening? NATO, who backs and supports this strange God, this Antichrist, who's really the Antichrist in Rome, they are working on causing all kinds of violence amongst the Arabic people. Turning the Arabic people against themselves, turning the Arabic people against the Europeans, the Americans, everybody. Until it's going to turn into nothing but a huge bloodbath. And then the United States will come into the Middle East like a whirlwind. And then they'll start doing some serious war over there. Just so that the Pope of Rome can take over Jerusalem. I think this is when Israel will come under a heavy attack. They want to force the honest to goodness, good-hearted Orthodox community that really does love the Lord. They're just blind to who the Messiah is. That they don't want the Pope of Rome in their country. They don't want this ecumenical movement along with this Orthodox bunch of backslidden renegade Orthodox community that is sucked up to the Rome. We're working on that too, by the way. We've got several friends that are working with us on there too, investigating all of these different rabbis that are involved. God bless those that are out there working with us to bring this together, to bring a report to you to show you what's really going on. So I wanted to show you this as well, what's happening here. Let me just give you a little bit of information about this. With the influx in the asylum seekers, Germany has seen a wave of violence against Muslim refugees and immigrants, including the attacks on shelters and homes. Agents France Presse reported Monday Germany has volunteered to take the highest number of refugees in the European Union, expecting between 800,000 to 1 million asylum seekers, most from the war-torn Middle East, before the end of the year. At least 222 homes belonging to the refugees were lit on fire since January. The local reporter cited an investigation in Germany's newspaper Die Zeit. Of those attacks in which 104 people were wounded, 4 people were prosecuted for their involvement, including the arson attacks. Die Zeit's investigation found that at least 747 crimes had been perpetrated against refugees in the nation since the beginning of the year. You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of back there in Germany, when they had the night of the breaking of the glass windows and stuff of the Jewish shops. This is what it reminds me of. And who was it? It was actually government people that went against. It was part of the Nazi party that dressed up as civilians and made it look like the civilians were against them. I think these atrocities are being conducted by governments, only masquerading as extremists in the country. Or maybe they're just paying the extremist. Isn't it funny how no prosecutions? They can't seem to find the perpetrators of all these violent acts? They're trying to stir up unrest in Europe. It's coming to America as well. This is why the black people's community in America is being stirred up as well. And I just encourage you, my brothers over there, don't be a partaker of it. This is what the government's trying to do, is stir up your communities to cause civil unrest in the United States. They need to bring about a one world government, a one world order. And they're well on their way to doing it. Well on their way to doing it. Anyway, one other quick little news update I'll tell you here. RT News brought out that today, or maybe I think this was on Saturday actually, provocative close call. U.S. military fume after Iran test fires a missile only 1.3 kilometers away from the USS Truman. Boy, that was close. The USS Truman was going, says the U.S. military was outraged when Iranian ships fired rockets in the Strait of Hormuz, as the USS Harry Truman, an aircraft carrier, was reportedly passing 1,500 yards away. U.S. Central Command called the drill provocative, unsafe, and unprofessional. The incident, which originally reported on Tuesday via 2 unnamed U.S. military officials speaking to NBC News, allegedly took place on Saturday. One of the officials said that the U.S. ship had been an internationally recognized maritime traffic lane, had not in any country's territorial waters during the time of Iran's naval exercises. Iran issued a warning over maritime radio shortly before conducting the missile test, asking vessels to remain clear. The USS Harry S. Truman was about 1,500 yards away from the launch location. The rockets were directed off the carrier's starboard side, away from the commercial ships and traffic lane, the sources said. Yet while Iranians were clearly not trying to target the U.S. ship, the officials called the drill unnecessary, provocative, and unsafe. I have to agree with that. I do agree with that. You know, Iran, it is clearly that the Iranians are doing this intentionally for provocation against the United States. Are they trying to get the United States to strike back? I mean, it's just nuts, friends, nuts. Anyway, I'm Stephen Ben-Nun. You've been watching Israeli News Live. If this news broadcast is a blessing to you, we do need your support as the year closes out here. We thank you for your kindness. We thank so many of you that are being a part and helping us to continue this type of prophetic news broadcast, keeping it going forward. You can go to our website, IsraeliNewsLive.org. We have a place you can give online, or if you go to IsraelReturns.com, which is our ministry site, we also have an address in Europe where you can send a check to us here. And yes, you can send U.S. checks because we deposit electronically into a U.S. bank. So it's perfectly okay to do that. If you send money orders, we end up having to send them back to the U.S. in order to get deposited by a friend that we have there. Anyway, I'm glad you tuned in this evening. I'm Stephen Ben-Nun with Israeli News Live. Shalom and good evening.
Now, the objective is the same, however, whether it's by a slow path or a quick path. The eventual goal is the replacement of the local culture with that of the conqueror. As they say in the police movies, we can do this the easy way or the hard way, but the result is the same, and the career of Antiochus IV was largely like this. In the first years as ruler of Israel, which was thought to be 175 through 170 BC, he attempted to woo the Jews into acceptance of Greek ideals and culture, in exchange for his protections and the influx of new wealth into the region. When he began building temples to the Greek gods all over Israel, extracting taxes to do so, and then began recognizing Greek laws ahead of local Jewish ones, Jewish resistance only began to grow. He was now beginning to oppress the people. By 167 BC, his frustrations had become so great that he lost his patience and simply began dictating life or death choices to the Jews, as he moved to eradicate the Jewish religion and culture once and for all. We continue now with our look at the works of Antiochus IV, as these will express the spirit of the modern New World Order as the final Antichrist comes to power. And I think this is what Jesus and Paul meant when they said, learn from the sign of the abomination of desolation. We study that sign as it worked out for Antiochus IV, and it gives us an idea of the kind of spirit that will underlie what's coming in the future. Now, Josephus in the Antiquities of the Jews, Book 12, Chapter 5, and Sentence 4, describes a temple desecration under Antiochus IV Epiphanes. By the way, his name was Epimanes, in fact, but he changed it to Epiphanes, which Epiphanes means a revelation of God, that shares many elements in common with that of the future Antichrist. Rabbinical commentaries identify the desecration by Antiochus IV as being the abomination of desolation prophesied of in Daniel 11:31. So just to remind us, Daniel 11:31 says, forces shall arise for his task. And that means he manages to raise armies. And they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. Then they shall take away the daily sacrifices, and he shall place there an abomination of desolation, which is the version from Daniel 11 in the King James Version, but a little bit edited by myself. Antiochus IV, whose reign actually extended from 215 through to 163 BC, and that's his image. He was king in Israel from those years. His desecration of the temple continued from about 167 through to 163. So it happened toward the end of his career. When we say desecration, this was when he began to do things like put a great image in the temple precinct. Here's a coin as well that sort of captures his face and profile. As I mentioned, his name was actually Epimanes, but he changed it to Epiphanes, meaning the manifestation of divinity, or sometimes also understood to be an appearance of God. Now, as I said, Epiphanes raised various temples to Zeus around the country, and we can read about that in 1 Maccabees 1:57, which is not in the Standard Bible today, but it's in the Catholic Bible. The temple of Zeus on Mount Olympus was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and Zeus was the chief god in those days. The whole story of Zeus was well known. Zeus had 12 sons and daughters: Apollo, Artemis, Heracles, Hebe, Hermes, Ares, Athena, Heracles, Perseus, Persephone, Io, and Hephaestus. Temples were built in Greece to honor each of these children of Zeus. And under Antiochus Epiphanes, the plan was to build such temples throughout all of Israel. It was in the 153rd Olympiad that Antiochus IV conquered Jerusalem and began imposing Greek secular culture on the Jews. And notice that sometimes the kind of historical links that were made were either to, for instance, which year of Julius Caesar was it, or which Olympiad was it, or which year in which Olympiad was it. And this gave us a good way to actually pin down events and the history of them. The Greeks didn't have an AD BC thing like we have today, so these are the kinds of references they made. Anyway, Antiochus IV conquered Jerusalem in the 153rd Olympiad. So that gives us a sort of plus or minus 3 or 4 years in terms of the actual date. He placed his royal seat or throne in the temple. He changed his name from Epimanes to Epiphanes, and that was probably an act of mockery, really, because the Jews may have said to him that he couldn't put his image in the temple because that was for God alone. So perhaps he jokingly said, well, I'll be God then, and changed his name to Epiphanes. He replaced the daily sacrifice of lambs with pigs, and of course pigs were an unclean animal to the Jew, and he utterly prohibited the worship of Jehovah in Israel. Such outright persecution was itself an abomination of desolation, let alone putting an image in the temple. According to Josephus, Antiochus showed his contempt for the God of the Jews by setting up a huge statue of Jupiter Olympus on the altar of sacrifice in the temple. So it wasn't in the Holy of Holies, which was probably too small a space, but further out there was a larger space, and that's where he put his statue. He followed up his action by erecting temples to Zeus all over Judea. We mentioned that from 1 Maccabees 1. At the heart of his great desecration was the transformation of Jehovah's temple in Jerusalem into the temple of Zeus. And it just so happens that the name Zeus, from Dios, which means God, really just means God. So it almost sounds acceptable to worship Zeus instead of Jehovah. One could almost imagine it was just another name. But the second commandment forbids the worship of any image of God and of any idol. So here's kind of a picture of what it might have looked like at that time. Try that again. Here we go. That was a huge image. Antiochus compelled Jews to accept the Greek religion, culture, and philosophy. In the illustration above, we can make out some Greek wrestling going on. You can see in the foreground, in the middle foreground there, people wrestling. And that was part of the Greek culture too. It was compulsory on pain of death for Jews to worship these Greek gods. But it got to the point where any copies of the book of the law, the Jewish Torah, were torn in pieces or set on fire publicly. It got worse and worse until anyone claiming that the Torah was holy was executed for saying so. Also from 1 Maccabees 1. Later, anyone even possessing the Torah was executed, according to Josephus in Antiquities of the Jews, Book 12. Indeed, the question of affiliation with Antiochus it also deepened the historical rift between the Jews and Samaritans. Samaritans lived in the northern parts of Israel. They'd been placed there by the Assyrians. The Assyrians had a habit of conquering countries and then taking the peoples they had conquered captive and then putting them into another country to live there. So the Samaritans had come from some other part of Asia and had been deposited in northern Israel by the Assyrians, the emperor at the time being Sennacherib. But meantime, he had deported the true Israelites and put them somewhere else, and that's a discussion for another time. So very few of the Samaritans would have been Israelites. And many of them, however, when they were in Israel and began to have children, began to adopt many of the Jewish beliefs. And they even used the first 5 books of the Bible as their holy books. This is still known as the Samaritan Pentateuch, and it serves as a useful reference today for Bible scholars in Old Testament studies because it's a comparative text to the Old Testament that we now receive as part of the Masoretic text. The Samaritans claimed to worship Jehovah at their own temple on Mount Gerizim. and they believed themselves to have favour with God for choosing to worship him. They already had this kind of pre-Christian Gentile belief that God would accept them as well as he would accept any Jew. But the Jews, for their part, disowned them outright and would not even speak to them. They saw them as a kind of travesty, some group of Gentiles that thought they could be Jews. Now, the Samaritans, with their temple at Mount Gerizim, were less concerned about the desecration at Jerusalem, and they didn't support the Jewish uprising against Antiochus. The liberation of the temple from Antiochus occurred exactly 3 years later, and it's now celebrated by the Jewish celebration of Hanukkah. The temple in Samaria was subsequently destroyed by the Maccabees, although Samaritans still worship today among its ruins. And that destruction of the temple in Samaria was in some ways a kind of revenge against the Samaritans not joining in the efforts against the Antiochian army. Antiochus IV, for his part, perished with a miserable disease at the age of 52. So he died as a reasonably young man. Rabbinical Jews largely ignored the Daniel 2 prophecy of Nebuchadnezzar's great statue, destroyed by the heaven-sent rock, because it didn't really fit well into their messianic conception. It didn't seem to contain anything showing the messianic dominion of Israel over the nations, that is, the millennial reign, and that's what they wanted to see. They wanted to think Messiah would come and conquer the nations, and allow them to rule as a nation over other nations. Instead, it showed the destruction of all nations and a whole new world before Messiah set up his kingdom. For most of the same reasons, they would later dismiss Jesus, who did not come as a nation-conquering messianic king, a political saviour for Israel, but instead as a sin-conquering high priest, a spiritual saviour of the nation. Now, not long before the appearance of Antiochus IV, the Hebrew Bible had in fact been translated into Greek, and the Bible had started to transform Greek-speaking people. And we're speaking here particularly of those Jews who were living in the north of Africa in Greek-speaking communities. So they were bilingual Jews. It was under the oversight of Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who reigned from 285 to 246 BC, that the Hebrew scriptures were translated into the Koine Greek of the Septuagint version. Now, it was called the Septuagint because there were 70 translators involved with its translation. And Ptolemy II was compassionate to the Greeks, to the Jews. He actually quite liked them, unlike Antiochus. And he was open to a translation of the Hebrew Torah in Greek so that Greek-speaking people could also learn about the Jewish religion. The effect of the Septuagint was as revolutionary then as the German translation by Martin Luther would be much later on in the 1500s AD. And the various translations by Erasmus in the same century were also had significant impact, as did the first English translations of the Bible by William Tyndale very soon afterwards in the 1500s. In the 1st century AD, as the church made its first inroads into Rome, powerful antichrist figures arose in the form of Caligula and Nero, and there in the background is an image of Caligula, I think. And after Jewish riots, Caligula attempted to place an image of himself in the Jerusalem temple. And in some ways, he sort of acted with the same kind of vengeful action as Antiochus IV had in his time. They knew that putting an image of a false god or of an emperor in the temple was going to be very egregious to the Jews, something that would highly offend them. And so it was a worse thing to do than going in and beating them up. Nero famously blamed the Christians 2 decades later for the fire of Rome, and perhaps it was an early false flag, I don't know. And then he directed a program of retribution against them to purge them from his empire. But once the Bible, now including the New Testament, began to be translated into Latin from about 150 AD for the benefit of the early church that was then in Rome, the gospel message moved steadily throughout the Roman Empire. And nothing Rome could do, really, including public executions or using Christians as lion bait in the sporting arenas, could seem to stem the growth of this movement. And yet antichrists arose and instigated purges against Christians every few centuries. One such purge, it's claimed, saw John the Revelator exiled to Patmos for his faith. It was never long after an explosion of Jewish faith before an antichrist figure would come along to try and bring the world back to reason and normality. Another significant persecution and desecration broke out under the Roman Emperor Diocletian, whose full name was Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus, in 290 AD. Diocletian's persecution also began with a sacrifice to Zeus, and that seems to be a recurring theme. Diocletian was responsible for the destruction of a great deal of the early church's literature, burning all that he could find. And what's interesting about his sacrifice to Zeus is that Diocletian, as a Roman, was making a sacrifice to a Greek god, and there was actually kind of an absorption and merging together of Greek and Roman religious ideas. The only places that the Christian scriptures actually survived after that purge were in North Africa, Britannia, and outside the Roman Empire. Just about everything in the empire was destroyed. And that terrible persecution under Diocletian lasted for 10 years. Now, one time while Diocletian was sacrificing in public, the chief interpreter of the victims' organs reported that he could not read the future in them and claimed this must be due to the hostile influence of Christians who were standing around. Diocletian then burst into a rage, insisting that all in his court should offer sacrifice, and this included the Christians, and he sent out orders to his army to follow suit. And this is in the history of Constantine, written by Ramsay MacMullen, page 24. This kind of irrational hatred is characteristic also of Antiochus IV, and we believe will also be characteristic of the Antichrist to come in the future. And here's a picture of Diocletian. He ruled from 245 AD through to 311. I mean, he lived for those years, and he ruled from 284 to 300. No, he reigned from 284 to 305. Here's a coin, human profile. Now, the Gentile, and by this I mean generally Greek, world into which the Apostle Paul ventured was, after all, devoted to Greek and Roman practices of worship and their divinities. The pagan world outside Israel was all effectively desecrated, in subjection, that is, to spiritual error and the spirit of the Antichrist. This spiritual world, in which people got to largely mix and match their personal gods and had to honour a few public gods as well, tried its best either to absorb what seemed like the narrow and rigid views of Christianity, or otherwise, in frustration, simply to eradicate it by force, that is, by the enforcement of new laws that now outlawed the religion. The Greek pantheon, to remind us, had 12 main gods, and in some ways this was interesting because Christ had 12 disciples. But this coincidence might be less significant if one considers there is a general 12ness about Greek society. This 12ness was based, in a sense, on their sort of idea about the magical properties of numbers. And 12, the 12-sided figure, the dodecahedron, was the one that represented the universe and the sort of social order. In Greek culture, there were 12 juras. There could be 12 cities built in a group. there was a base 12 counting system, 12 months in a year, 12 hours in a day, etc. Probably itself stemming from early Babylonian metaphysical ideas that 12 was the number underpinning the divine geometry. As I mentioned, the dodecahedron, a 12-sided platonic solid, was considered to symbolize the greater cosmos which contained the gods. The 6-sided cube was the shape depicting the inner cosmos of man within, who lived in a subspace of that greater cosmos. When Paul did miracles in association with his preaching to the Greeks, the people were sure that one of the gods must have come down to them. They even prepared to offer a sacrifice to Paul, who they thought must be a living God. Acts chapter 14, 11-14 tells us about this occurrence. Because Paul, I guess, had been speaking, great things about Jesus Christ, but also performing miracles. And when the people saw what Paul did, they raised their voices, saying, "The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. Then the priest of Zeus brought oxen and garlands to the gates, intending to sacrifice to Paul with the multitudes. So they really believed that these were divinities that had suddenly appeared in their midst. Now, the great city of Ephesus itself was built, in fact, around a meteorite. And this meteorite seemed to have a female image formed upon it. And the people reasoned that Zeus himself had thrown the image down and required the Ephesians to worship it, and that the image was of his daughter Artemis, also called in that time Diana and Venus. It was against such superstitions that Paul contended. In fact, this language of descent from heaven was very powerful to the Greeks, and indeed to first-century Jews who were surrounded by the same Greek beliefs and stories. Jesus made use of this language of being sent down as he described his mission on earth. And the claim of his being sent from heaven was even more strongly underwritten by the fact of his virgin birth, although Greek gods, as a rule, did not make their appearance on earth as babies. Nevertheless, the fact that Jesus spoke of having come down from heaven would have indicated to former Greek idol worshippers that Jesus was someone who should be worshipped as a god. But where they might have worshipped Jesus, it was another matter to accept the message being presented by Paul. Although Paul was being hailed at first as a living God, he seemed to be presenting a message that contradicted what had earlier been taught to the Greeks, apparently by Zeus himself. Paul's message now looked like that of a mischievous god, an enemy of Zeus, and while his miracles should have accredited him to the Jews, his message now placed him at peril. Acts 19:35, and when the town clerk had appeased the people, he said, "Ye men of Ephesus, what man is there that does not know that the city of the Ephesians is given to the worship of the great goddess Diana," which is also called Artemis, "and of her image which descended from Zeus." The worship of Diana had become quite a money spinner for the Ephesians. The city provided many enticements to the worshippers of Diana as well. In fact, it offered worshippers both male and female prostitutes, which was legal fornication. It offered a great deal of income to those producing religious carvings and inscriptions. It was a major center for disseminating the religion of Diana. It provided local holidays for many and a destination for religious pilgrimage. So rich was the city that the Temple of Diana was another of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Of course, a steady influx of all too religious worshippers brought the local artisans money and livelihood, and the people of Ephesus were immediately worried that Paul's preaching against their gods would not only destroy their careers, but would also dishonor the goddess Diana herself, not to mention the city's worldwide fame and attraction as a site for pilgrimage. Acts 19:27. So that not only this, our craft is in danger to be set at naught, but also that the temple of the goddess Diana should be despised, and her magnificence should be destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worships. So while Paul was received as a god, he was also rejected because of his threat to the society. So therefore he was seen more as an evil god, a divider, a seditious god. And to many people, the gospel and Christianity is seen as in some way actually being seditious. Now, ironically, this is an image, by the way, of Diana with her many breasts. She's a kind of super mother figure, a divine mother, if you like. Ironically, Christianity has its own Diana in Ephesus, if you care to accept it. Many believe that a living image of Zeus is still desecrating the spiritual temple, if you like, the church, and the name of that image of Zeus is the Pope. Indeed, the statue of Zeus that the early Catholics recommissioned and used at the Vatican was originally the statue. The statue of Peter was originally the statue of Zeus. The statue of the goddess Venus was likewise also adapted into the statue of Mary. So ironically, there's a kind of physical identification between the two religions as well. Now, here we have a statue of Jupiter, or Zeus, who is now called Peter at the Vatican. The papacy is certainly then one of the images or heads of the beast in Revelation 13, through its identification with the pagan religions of earlier times. Not full identification, but certainly a partial identification. Many, particularly those of the historicist line of interpretation, indeed believe the Pope is the real Antichrist, and that it will be the Pope who sits himself in the Temple of Jerusalem once it falls. And this was actually the belief of all first-generation Protestant reformers in the 1500s. We're going to take a look at another video here regarding the Vatican and some of its history. If the final 3.5 years of history under the man of sin are intended to be a microcosm of the whole church age, one would have to expect that the one who sits on a throne in the Jerusalem temple could quite possibly be the Pope himself, because the Pope has been seated in charge of the church for so many centuries of our history. However, this notion of microcosm representing macrocosm would mean not only that the Pope sat in Jerusalem, but that his mouth has always been the mouth of Lucifer himself, and such an extreme view might be hard to substantiate, especially to Catholics. The Vatican, for the books, has already promised financial and moral support to rebuild the temple when the possibility of its reconstruction arises. Currently, though, there is a debate going on about who exactly will have final jurisdiction over the Temple Mount. The Palestinians believe it is a Palestinian territory. The Vatican says it belongs to them. An elite Spanish Illuminati family also lays claim to ownership of Jerusalem dating back to the Middle Ages, and Lord Rothschild is also said to have purchased Jerusalem back in the early 1900s. I'm sure there's a great deal of talking that needs to be done first. We finish up with another video, a third video, and this talks about the Pope's claims to hold control of Israel's third temple site, and therefore its reconstruction.
Today's historic talks between the Vatican and Israel are scheduled to be finalized this upcoming December 2013. The unprecedented negotiations fit precisely into major end-time prophecies today, and here are some key reasons why. First of all, the talks are focused on the fundamental agreement, which is an actual contract, originated and authored in 1993 by Pope John Paul II. Amazingly, in the fundamental agreement itself, in Article 4, the Vatican requires, in fact demands, that Israel give the Pope immediate and full legal custody of the Holy Land, the Temple Mount itself, and other landmark holy sites. The contract also gives the Pope full legal authority to do whatever he wants at will and sovereignly while inside the borders of Israel, including conducting all Roman Catholic rituals anywhere he pleases, and without any legal challenges whatsoever from any other national and international body, including Israel. In fact, the Vatican Agreement actually requires all of these details I've just presented to be incorporated into Israel's very own laws. Another major dynamic which bolsters all of this prophetically is the fact that Vatican State is internationally recognized as a monarchy with the Pope as its supreme leader and virtual king. This means that once the agreement is signed, then suddenly a virtual king, the Pope, can operate inside Israel and at the Temple Mount at will and unchecked, and answering to no one. This is exactly the foretold end-time picture of what's coming at the midpoint of the coming 7-year tribulation, when the Pope, Antichrist, is then unleashed to annihilate everyone in his path for the final 3.5 years of Great Tribulation. In closing, 4 other keys are critical to recognize scripturally. Number 1 is that since Daniel 9:27 shows that the 2 prime parties who join into a firm 7-year covenant or contract will be Antichrist, the papacy, and the end-time Jews of Israel, then obviously today's Vatican-Israel negotiations are crystallized as setting the stage for the nearing 7-year agreement of Daniel 9:27. Secondly, and as I've stated many times at the site and in videos, the fundamental agreement will either be the springboard towards the coming 7-year agreement, or the fundamental agreement could virtually become the foretold 7-year agreement itself. A third significant fact is that the 1993 fundamental agreement was not created by Israel, but authored and made by Antichrist, the Pope. This is exactly what Daniel 9:27's divinely inspired wordage states, saying that he, meaning Antichrist, is the one who will make a firm covenant or contract with end-time Israel and not vice versa. Again, this is precisely what has already come to pass today to the T. right before our eyes and nearing its scheduled signing in December. My fourth and final point is the most crucial end-time information to be alert to now pertaining to Antichrist, and is also what I'm on record in writing originally in the book Here is Wisdom, copyrighted in 1984 in the Library of Congress, and can be read at heisnear.com at no charge. And that is, whichever pope actually executes a 7-year agreement with the end-time Jews of Israel, he will be the virtual Antichrist himself. Finally, and with all of this in mind and beyond any doubt, this generation is now adjacent to and up close and personal with the start of the final 7-year tribulation.